じゃあ次ですね。
Okay, so here, I have to cut vertically. Woo! Oh.
As if to say those technical difficulties from the first E3 display were a bad omen, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword has quickly become a controversial part of the Zelda franchise. If fan reactions are anything to go by, this game is at the same time the best thing to ever happen to the series, an awful turd straight from that one hole in Majora's Mask, and yeah.
More than any other game in the series, Skyward Sword has left everyone who's played it unable to mutually agree on any of the decisions it took as the most recent Zelda title. So, the question rabbidluigi and I ask here is, why? For this review, we're leaving no stone unturned. We're looking to examine every important aspect of Skyward Sword's presentation, story, and gameplay in order to determine what might be worth your time and why. How does this game reflect the Zelda series and gaming as a whole?
Let's dive into that, starting with the presentation. Starting now, there's gonna be some spoilers, so watch out. Visually speaking, Skyward Sword's art style is slightly reminiscent of Wind Waker, but with some noticeable differences. It features a similarly wide palette of bright colour and cel shading that resembles pastel art rather than the more caricatured style of Wind Waker. The latter decision was incorporated in the game to make seeing enemy weaknesses a lot easier during combat. Aside from the decision more or less working in the combat's favour, though that's not to say we couldn't see well in something like Twilight Princess, this art direction and colour shading also substantially contributed to what atmosphere there was in places like the Silent Realms, the Ancient Cistern, and the settings for the game's final two boss battles.
In terms of character and creature designs, this game takes a sort of middle ground between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. They look alright, though it's really nothing to write home about. Like in Twilight Princess, Link and Zelda are among the few characters in the game who look relatably human, while nearly everyone else looks colossally deformed. To Skyward Sword's credit, almost everyone in Twilight Princess who wasn't Link, Zelda, or a monster looked fucking disgusting, only worsened by the whole real is desaturated vibe going around. But a lot of Skyward Sword's character and creature designs look too silly, for lack of a better word. I know appearances aren't everything, but some of these designs and how they're used remove most of the gravity from the experience. Think back to Wind Waker, where your first real adventure in the game is where you're a little cartoon kid venturing into a volcano. You're only expecting more whimsy at first, and then suddenly, BAM! You're fighting this deformed titan with claws, and you're thrown for a loop because a while ago there was all this happy imagery. It really ups the ante of the game, and you feel like a total badass in the end for slaying this abomination as your first real quest. And it's all done by that scrawny little kid you're controlling. We know that not every boss in Wind Waker was imposing, but the Goma battle is a noteworthy example of expectations and resulting payoff in a Zelda game.
Contrast Wind Waker's method of visual storytelling to that of Skyward Sword, which is building up this sealed Demon King the whole game. Disappointingly, when you first see it, it's a demon muppet with toes! And how about when you're faced with a really unique set piece, a sinking pirate ship? It's getting wrecked by this tentacled thing. And when you finally see it, the Rasta squid that rises from the sea has the goofiest, most plain weak spot possible, and generally looks like the elephantitis-ridden hellspawn of Mike Wazowski and his girlfriend from Monsters Inc. I'm not quite sure that the fuck was the desired reaction to this moment. Well, alright, the designs for some of the other bosses like Koloktos and Akuma, Demise, are pretty sleek, though the only other designs that really stand tall in this game are those of the character Groose and of the villain Girahim. Groose has a simple design that perfectly emulates his character, with a Gaston-like posture and a foppish hairdo, that only a moron like Groose would find remotely cool. On the flip side, Girahim has this very streamlined design that conveys elegance, yet is deliberately contrasted to the character's completely batshit insanity. The result is a memorable character who is threatening on a multi-dimensional level, and whose dramatic movements and antics are some of the highlights in the game, though we're not sure if that was always intentional.
While the art design is better than the character design, even that has some issues. There's still that good old-fashioned Nintendo tradition of having your sword clip through surfaces like a ghost, and I swear the leaves on the trees in Faron Woods are all paper sheets. Seriously, there's cheating and then there's going back to N64 tricks. There are several cases in Skyward Sword's visual style that hold up amongst the rest of the series, though it's flawed enough to make anyone stand back and question some of the choices made.
In terms of music, Skyward Sword is the first Zelda game to have a mostly orchestrated soundtrack. This would sound like a perfect fit for Zelda given the touted majesty of its previous titles, and indeed, there are some really good pieces brought about through this orchestra, particularly most of the boss themes that are given that extra ounce of epicness. Unfortunately, the composition of most of the themes themselves tends to suffer. While this is obviously a subjective topic, most of the Zelda games have brought about numerous pieces of music people might call classic, and you can usually count several of them to pop them in video game medleys or even concerts. For the life of me, the only composition I can really think of from Skyward Sword that stacks up to such Zelda pieces is Fi's theme and all its variations. Perhaps the composers had a difficult time composing theme music due to this game's often strange setting and tone. We'll get into that more when we talk about the story. A lot of the world themes, as a result of that inconsistency, don't carry those sensations of heroism or a grand adventure throughout the soundtrack as a whole, instead opting for such feelings as forest, volcano and desert. It makes levels that should be more exciting a lot more tedious and surprisingly mundane.
Another guess of ours is that it's possibly due to the use of the orchestra itself. We can't be sure what was going on behind the scenes 100%, but if you have this big orchestra, you're gonna want to get your money's worth and use it. Now, despite the incredible variety of instruments you can find in an orchestra, think back to some of the themes from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. The Forest Temple music from Ocarina of Time is remembered so well by gamers because of the incredibly bizarre and uncommon sounds used in its composition. It really makes you wonder, what the hell am I listening to? And it amps up the eeriness of an already unsettling temple to truly classic levels. Some other examples of this kind of unique composition can be found in Ocarina of Time's Water Temple theme, Majora's Mask's Final Hours theme, and the theme of the Reversed Stone Tower Temple. And that's to name a few. The only themes I can remember that illustrated this point to that degree in Skyward Sword were the Silent Realm themes, and to this soundtrack's credit, they did their job. Something's gonna go horribly wrong now, isn't it? Not like this! Not like this! Our point is, Skyward Sword really doesn't have a ton of variance in its music due to how traditionally it's orchestrated, nor does it take a lot of risks. The result is something that, while still okay in its own right, doesn't quite break the mold like we've come to expect from the series.
On the whole, the presentation's alright, though especially for a later Wii game, it's easy to see where disappointment might arise.
I'd say this is where things get complicated, but oddly it's the complete reversal of that. In this series of twisty, turny, timey-wimey plots, Skyward Sword ends up simplifying a lot of the important dynamics of the series, and the result is frustrating.
The story begins with Link training to be a knight in the floating town of Skyloft, while building upon his relationship with childhood friend Zelda. This portrayal of Zelda is, initially, a unique one for the series because she's much closer to Link, and even has a more friendly design about her. However, this ends up being wasted potential as Zelda vanishes the moment the prologue ends. And your initial objective while travelling to the first 3 dungeons of the game is to find Zelda at the end. Aside from the introductions of Girahim and Impa, nothing is revealed about the plot of the game in the first 3 dungeons before Zelda disappears as if to say, "Thank you Link, but your princess is in another dungeon." Progressive game.
The pacing of Skyward Sword is awful. Think back to Ocarina of Time, where between the first 2 dungeons you met Zelda and learned more about the plot. It rewarded you for completing your first trial and set up your journey further. Following that, you were introduced to more new characters and cultures, raising the stakes and deepening your interest in the world. In Skyward Sword, there is next to none of this. The different species are there, but none of them change or even interact with you all that much over the course of your journey. This results in a much less integrating adventure where the world takes the back seat to Link, and your only motivation is, boy, I can't wait till I complete the next 3 dungeons to find out what the hell's going on and why I should care. As a result, the game often felt like a slog where I was completing puzzle after puzzle, desperately hoping to find something I would care about afterwards. Even with a game like Okami that's 40 hours long, the pacing was much better because between plot-centric events there was more to do, more to interact with, new landscapes to explore rather than the same few the whole game, and characters that evolved even in older locations. This kind of storytelling made games like this and other 3D Zelda titles feel more like experiences rather than unending tasks.
As Skyward Sword goes on, there are even fewer references to the plot along the way, and often with exceptionally lengthy sequences of padding or filler between them, which we'll get into further when we bring up gameplay. This game takes around 25 to 30 hours to complete, yet for how few scenes of plot there are interspersed between the dungeons, in any game with good pacing it could have taken half that time to tell a story. In a story that's supposed to feel grand, as the new origin point of the entire Zelda storyline, it really feels like there's not a lot happening. There'll be story, and suddenly there won't be any for very long stretches. It often feels schizophrenic, and even after completing all the game's padding, by the end of it all I really didn't care much about the world that had to be saved. Compared to something like Majora's Mask, where there are 4 well-defined races and multiple layers to Terminian society and culture, each of the new species introduced in Skyward Sword are surprisingly depthless. The Mogma's one personality trait is that they're obsessed with treasure. Those weird robots, yeah, I don't get it either, just make a lot of robot-y noises, and that's apparently quirky and funny. And the Kikwees, okay, they get a pass because they're so damn adorable. Seriously, someone make a plushie of these little guys. Rather than be a part of the adventure, these species felt like just another thing in the background, and it made the world seem a lot more barren than it was already intended to be.
While the main questline is inevitably on the more serious side since, you know, evil force trying to plunge the land into darkness and you must stop it, there's an obnoxious contrast between that seriousness and the downright silly portrayal of this game's dragon spirits. Each of these servants of the goddess are shockingly irresponsible for forces you're supposed to be supporting, and they only hinder your mission to create the Song of the Hero and summon the Triforce. The water dragon Pharaon has a hissy fit and floods the forest region after you know, saved its life. The thunder dragon Lanayru somehow died on duty, and Eldin. Ye gods, Eldin! The fire dragon Eldin causes a volcanic eruption because it had an explosion of its power. What does that even mean? Seriously, these godlike beings can't control their own powers? Does Eldin have godly bowel incontinence? These dragons artificially lengthen the game with some truly boring padding missions, paint a negative image of your side of the conflict, and overall make this game's tone even less consistent. Between how one-dimensional its races are and how irresponsible its guardians are, there's a startling lack of dignity in the Hyrule of Skyward Sword.
Topping off Skyward Sword's messy story is how it retroactively affects the rest of the Zelda continuity. Though we do learn neat tidbits such as the history of the Master Sword and how it was made, some of the plot points introduced in Skyward Sword arguably set the series' progress back. In Skyward Sword, not only is Zelda the damsel in distress as quickly as the very beginning of the game, when you finally go back in time and find her after reforging the Master Sword, she proves to be something worse. A glorified plot device. She's the reincarnation of the goddess Hylia, meaning that every version of Zelda after her is literally fated to be a damsel in distress due to the desirable godlike power she's born with. Again, progressive game. While this idea in itself practically sets women's right back to the 1980s, one could make the argument that even a damsel Zelda has put a unique spin on the cliché, in cases like Spirit Tracks where she's a ghost, but is still actively kicking ass. Even so, Skyward Sword does the damsel thing badly. She offers to make herself the living seal for the Demon King demise, meaning that she's basically absent from the plot for the entire endgame. You gotta love when video game writers create a girl character and they end up either being just another thing to save, or, you know, they start rambling on about babies.
The most frustrating part of these retcons is how they affect the future antagonist Ganondorf. As you defeat the true form of the Demon King demise in the distant past, he places a curse upon Link and Zelda's descendants in the form of an incarnation of his pure hatred. Now, of course this means Ganondorf is the incarnation, and it makes sense, right? He's a red-haired, muscular baddie that constantly returns to haunt whatever version of Link and Zelda seem to live in a given setting. However, Ganondorf's characterization in the series has been changing over time into one where he's hinted to have more complex motivations beyond "take over the world because I'm the opposite of good." In Wind Waker, Ganondorf says that he wanted to take over Hyrule to give better treatment to his native race, the Gerudo, resorting to using legends of great magic to attain his goals and slowly growing entranced by the prospect of power as a consequence. Sure, the well-intentioned extremist thing is a cliché in and of itself, but it at least raises a few possibly interesting moral questions to those invested in Zelda lore. Why are the Gerudo segregated in a freaking desert? Is the royal family to blame for Ganondorf entering the Sacred Realm? Well, according to Skyward Sword, neither of those questions are appropriate. Turns out Ganondorf didn't care about helping his people. He was born evil thanks to demise, he's fated solely to spite those who support Link and Zelda in each form he takes, and whatever hints of humanizing qualities he has were probably pure evil deep down. Fuck that!
The reveal that Ganondorf is pure hatred incarnate is an ill-conceived retcon akin to that crap from Phantom Menace where the Force is revealed to be some sort of microscopic faux scientific bullshit. While the hints of Ganondorf having humanising traits were there, Ganondorf is still unabashedly evil, and due to this twist, we'll probably never see any greater developments into Ganondorf as a character. It removes the mystery for something that didn't need an answer in order to be satisfying, and it simplifies the more mature evolution of Ganondorf all the way back to how he was in the 80s, just evil, evil, evil. There really isn't too much to say about the story of Skyward Sword. The most we can say in its favour is that the character of Groose is a decent example of character development, and that Giriam is an effective baddie due to his insanity, along with the additions of Link having more varied expressions and some dialogue choices to up the immersion factor. Aside from that though, the story doesn't stand out in the series for the right reasons.